I was a respiratory therapist in the ER, and there is one patient whose last breath still lingers with me, like a shadow lodged in my own lungs, waiting to surface when the room gets too quiet. My name is Elena Vargas. I am 32 years old, and though I thought I knew breath better than most, nothing prepared me for the night when breath itself seemed to become something else. Something I could not measure, could not chart, could not fight with any machine or skill. I came to Tucson, chasing air. That might sound strange, but it is true. I grew up in El Paso, where the desert heat pressed down heavy and the dust storms rolled in without warning, filling your mouth with grit and your chest with ache. My younger brother Daniel was born with fragile lungs. Asthma was the word they gave us. But to me as a child it felt like he lived always on the edge of suffocation. The smallest trigger could send him gasping, his little body folding forward as if he were drowning, though there was no water in sight. We spent nights on the cold plastic chairs of emergency rooms, the fluorescent lights too bright, the nurses' shoes squeaking down polished halls. My grandmother raised us after my mother died, too young, too sudden for me to understand then. She would hold Daniel against her chest, whispering prayers in Spanish while his breath wheezed like broken reeds in the wind. I remember watching the respiratory therapist set up the nebulizer, the steady hands adjusting tubing, the mask pressed to my brother's small face. Within minutes his chest would ease, his eyes would close in exhaustion, and I would feel the world tilt back toward safety. That image stayed with me, the miracle of a machine delivering air, of a professional coaxing life back with nothing more than precision and breath. So when it came time to choose a path, I didn't hesitate. I trained as a respiratory therapist, determined to become the kind of presence who could steady the storm inside a chest. I wanted to be the calm in the chaos, the one who gave back the air others were losing, and for a while it was enough. But life does not let you settle easily. My grandmother, the anchor of our family, died when I was 26. Daniel had grown stronger by then, managing his condition, but her absence hollowed something in me. Then came the breakup. A relationship I had poured myself into only to watch it rot from the inside with betrayal and silence. One day I looked at my life in El Paso and realized it was filled with ghosts. Every street corner, every familiar face, every windstorm carried too much memory. So I left. Tucson felt like a compromise between distance and familiarity. The desert was the same but different, the horizon still wide but painted with new mountains. I told myself the dry air would be kinder, cleaner. I told myself a new hospital would be a chance to start over. St. Catherine's Medical Center took me in, and I stepped into its ER, believing I had outrun the shadows. But the ER does not let you escape. It magnifies everything you carry inside. The first months at St. Catherine's blurred into a haze of shifts, gunshot victims from the border towns, heat stroke victims pulled from stalled cars, overdoses that arrived too late. Each case left a mark, but I learned to tuck them away, to focus on the mechanics of the job, monitor oxygen saturation, adjust the ventilator, calculate PEEP and tidal volume. If you focused hard enough on numbers, you could almost convince yourself that life was as measurable as it looked on the screen. The night it happened began like any other. Tucson summers were merciless, and the ER pulsed with heat. Even at midnight the air felt baked, as if the desert sun still radiated from the pavement outside. The waiting room overflowed, families fanning themselves with crumpled registration papers, children crying from dehydration, an old man slumped against the wall with sweat darkening his shirt. Inside the trauma bays we were already stretched thin. A teenager with a shattered leg from a motorcycle accident occupied Bay 2. Bay 4 held a woman in her 40s who had collapsed at a backyard barbecue, her body crumpling mid-sentence when the heat overcame her. I had been on my feet 12 hours, my throat raw from breathing through a mask, my mind dulled by the endless hiss of oxygen flow meters. I remember standing in the supply room for a moment, trying to collect myself, when the call came over the intercom. Incoming, respiratory standby, male patient unresponsive, ETA 2 minutes. My body moved before my mind caught up. I grabbed the intubation kit, checked the ventilator circuit, and stepped back into the corridor. When they wheeled him in, I felt the shift in the air. Male, late 60s, skin the color of ash. He was breathing, but only barely. Each inhalation a tremor, each exhalation a rattle. His chest rose unevenly, like the bellows of a broken instrument. The monitors confirmed what my eyes already knew. Oxygen saturation plummeting in the 70s. Heart struggling to keep pace. His daughter trailed behind, her face flushed with panic. She clutched a worn leather purse to her chest, as though it could shield her from what she was seeing. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "Please don't let him go." The words hit me harder than I expected, maybe because I heard my own grandmother in them. That same raw pleading, that helpless surrender to strangers in scrubs. We moved fast. The ER always looks like chaos to outsiders. Monitors beeping, voices shouting, shoes pounding against tile. But inside, for those of us who live it, there is rhythm. The doctor barked orders, the nurses drew blood, and I leaned in to adjust the oxygen mask, trying to coax more air into failing lungs. His skin was clammy under my hand, his lips tinged with blue. That was when I heard it for the first time. A whisper, faint and fragile, carried on a dying breath. I bent closer, thinking he might be trying to ask for water, or for his daughter. But the words that reached me were different. "Not again," he murmured, the syllables almost lost in the rattle of his throat. I froze, startled by the clarity of it. Patients in distress say many things. Sometimes nonsense, sometimes prayers, sometimes just groans of pain. But this was deliberate. Not again. I leaned closer, thinking maybe I had misheard. Maybe he had said something more ordinary. His lips trembled, another breath slipping out. "Don't let it in." The hair on the back of my neck rose. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, glassy but fixed on mine, as if the words were meant only for me. Then they rolled back, and his chest shuddered, a gasp that sounded like the body preparing to surrender. The attending physician's voice snapped me back. "He's going down. Intubate." And just like that, the rhythm took over. I lifted the laryngoscope, my hands steady despite the adrenaline hammering through me. The tube slid past his vocal cords, and within seconds we had him on the ventilator. The machine hissed, precise and unyielding, forcing air into a body that had nearly given up. His oxygen levels crept upward, but the words he had whispered stayed lodged in my mind. "Not again. Don't let it in." I told myself it was hypoxia, the brain starved of oxygen inventing nonsense. I told myself I had misheard in the chaos. But when I looked up, his daughter was staring at me, her face pale as the sheets. "Did he say it again?" she whispered. My chest tightened. "Say what?" I asked, though I already knew. She clutched the purse tighter. He told me not to let it in." I didn't know what to say. The monitors beeped steadily, the ventilator hissed, and for the first time in my career, I felt that the air in the room carried something more than oxygen. Something waiting. The hours that followed blurred into a cycle of alarms, procedures, and the relentless hiss of the ventilator. Once the tube was secure, and the machine delivering steady breaths, the initial panic in the room gave way to the grinding work of stabilization. His numbers improved slightly, oxygen saturation climbing from the red zone into something survivable, though still far from safe. But his body resisted every intervention like a stubborn lock refusing the right key. I stood at the head of the bed, adjusting settings, calculating tidal volume, fine-tuning PEEP. These were second nature to me, the language of machines, the invisible math of lungs. But no matter how carefully I adjusted, he fought the rhythm. His chest rose unevenly, as if the air itself was foreign. Each time the ventilator pushed, his body seemed to recoil, muscles stiffening. The doctor ordered labs, chest X-ray, and ABG results. The arterial blood gas came back, showing severe acidosis, his body drowning in its own carbon dioxide. The chest film revealed patchy infiltrates. Likely pneumonia, though the distribution was odd, almost cloud-like across both lungs. I knew the drill. We've seen pneumonia so severe it strangles the airways, seen sepsis pull life out by the minute. But this felt different. It was as if the lungs weren't merely failing. They were refusing. His daughter hovered close, her presence both fragile and unyielding. She wore a faded denim jacket over a sundress, her hands constantly twisting the purse strap until her knuckles blanched. Every time a monitor beeped, her eyes flicked toward me, searching for answers I couldn't give. "Was he sick before tonight?" I asked her, during a brief lull. Her eyes darted toward her father's pale face before returning to me. "He's had trouble sleeping," she whispered. "But not like this." He kept saying he couldn't rest, that something was pressing on him, like a weight on his chest at night. Sleep paralysis, I thought immediately. I'd read accounts of patients describing crushing sensations at night, terrifying but not fatal, hallucinations born of the body betraying itself. But paired with what he had whispered, "Don't let it in," the explanation didn't sit right. The doctor returned with updates. Blood cultures sent, antibiotics started, vasopressors ordered as his blood pressure began to dip. We all worked methodically, but the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. It wasn't just the patient's declining numbers. It was his words, the daughter's quiet confirmation, and the way every breath forced into his lungs seemed unwilling to stay. At one point, I leaned in to suction his airway, clearing secretions the ventilator couldn't manage. As I slid the catheter in, I heard a faint sound, soft but distinct. A sigh. Not from him. It was timed between ventilator cycles, when the machine was paused and his own body gave nothing. It came from the room itself, low and tired, as if the walls exhaled. I jerked back, my gloved hand trembling for a second before I forced myself to continue. The nurses around me didn't react. To them, nothing had happened. By 3 a.m., he coded. The flatline tore through the room, sharp and merciless. We leapt into action. Chest compressions started. Medications drawn and pushed into his veins. The doctor calling for shocks. His body jerked under the defibrillator pads, the smell of singed skin lingering. I counted compressions under my breath, sweat running down my spine. "Come on," I muttered, pressing my palms against his sternum, feeling ribs strain under the force. "Come on, breathe." After 2 minutes, his heart rhythm sputtered back, weak but present. The monitor chirped life again, and we all allowed the briefest sigh of relief. But his face, even unconscious, was locked in tension. His brow furrowed, his lips moving faintly around the tube. I bent close to check, and though the sound was faint, I heard it again. Not again. I told myself it was air escaping the cuff of the tube, a trick of suction and vibration. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. His daughter must have seen the way I stiffened, because she whispered, "He said that to me last week. He said, 'It's coming back. It always comes back.'" I wanted to ask her what he meant, but the words lodged in my throat. The truth is, in medicine we deal in science, not omens. We comfort families with percentages and protocols, not with speculation about shadows in the air. Yet part of me, tired, stretched thin from too many nights in this ER, felt the edges of belief bending. We kept him alive through sheer force of will, but his numbers never stabilized. His blood pressure sagged despite medications, his kidneys began to fail. By dawn, it was clear we were in a holding pattern, keeping his body tethered while something deeper slipped further away. I left the room briefly to grab supplies. The corridor outside was quiet, the kind of pre-dawn lull that settles over even the busiest ERs. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and I felt a strange pressure in my own chest, like I had inhaled too deeply and the air refused to leave. I leaned against the wall, waiting for the sensation to pass. When it finally did, I heard faint crying from inside the bay. His daughter's voice, broken, whispering words I couldn't make out. When I stepped back in, I found her gripping his hand, tears streaking her cheeks. "He told me not to let it in," she murmured again, this time louder, as if testing whether I would acknowledge it. I met her eyes. And for the first time in my career, I didn't have an answer. Not medical, not logical, not human. Just silence. The rest of the shift crawled toward morning, each minute stretching with the weight of unanswered questions. He lingered, half alive, caught between machine and silence. And with every hiss of the ventilator, I felt more certain that breath had become something else entirely in that room. When the sun rose and the desert outside glowed with heat, I thought of my brother back in El Paso, the sound of his childhood gasps echoing in my memory. I thought of my grandmother, whispering prayers into the night. And I thought of the dying man beneath my hands, whispering warnings with his last stolen breaths. It was only the beginning. By mid-morning, the ER was no quieter, but my perception of it had changed. Normally, the constant alarms, the rolling gurneys, the clipped commands spoken over beeping monitors formed a kind of background music that I could block out. But now every sound felt sharpened, drawn to the surface, as though I was hearing it all for the first time. Each ventilator hiss seemed to carry weight. Each suction canister gurgle sounded like a whisper underwater. The patient lay in Bay 5, tethered to the machine that pushed and pulled breath into him. His chest rose and fell with mechanical rhythm, but it looked unnatural, like a puppet whose strings were being yanked without grace. I kept checking the tubing, convinced something was wrong, but everything was technically perfect. His numbers on the screen hovered in a fragile balance. Oxygen saturations in the low 90s, blood pressure kept afloat by pressors, heart rate erratic but present. By all accounts, he was alive. Yet when I looked at him, I felt the unmistakable sense that life had already slipped somewhere else, leaving only a husk that refused to let go. The daughter remained rooted by his bedside. I offered her a chair once, but she declined, shaking her head as though sitting might mean surrender. She leaned against the rail, her face drawn tight, whispering things to him I couldn't always hear. Once I caught a fragment. "It's not welcome here. You can fight it." Another time, "Remember what you told me. Close the door this time." I wanted to ask her what she meant, but the air between us carried too much tension. Families sometimes say odd things in crisis. Bargains with God, half-remembered promises. But something about her words felt rehearsed, as though she and her father had spoken of this before, many times. At one point, she turned to me suddenly, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. "Do you believe people can fight things that aren't in their body? Things outside that try to get in?" I froze, caught between professional detachment and something deeper stirring in me. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully, keeping my tone neutral. She glanced at her father, then back at me. "When I was little, I'd wake up and hear him gasping. I'd run to his room, and he'd be sitting straight up in bed, clutching his chest. He always said the same thing. It tried again. He never explained, just that it wasn't done with him." Her hands twisted the purse strap again, leather squeaking. When I got older, I stopped asking, but last week he told me it was coming again, that it always comes back when he's weak, that one day it won't leave. I wanted to tell her it was sleep apnea, or nocturnal asthma, or heart failure creeping in. I wanted to give her something medical, something anchored in the measurable. But my throat dried, because deep down I wasn't sure anymore. Not after what I had heard him whisper. Not after the sigh I swore had moved through the room like an invisible presence. Just before noon, his vitals dipped sharply. Alarms erupted, shrill and merciless. I rushed in with the team. His heart rate plummeted, blood pressure unreadable. The ventilator alarmed, detecting resistance, as though his lungs were clamping down against the air forced into them. The doctor shouted for compressions, and I moved instinctively, hands on his chest, pressing down with the practiced rhythm drilled into my muscles. The sound of ribs cracking under pressure is one you never forget, though you learn to ignore it for survival. This time it echoed louder in my ears, like wood splintering in a quiet forest. Sweat ran down my forehead as I counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, each compression a plea. His daughter sobbed against the wall, her face buried in her hands. "Clear!" the doctor called for shock. His body jerked against the table, the smell of scorched flesh rising faintly, acrid and unmistakable. We cycled through the motions, compressions, medications, shocks. Minutes stretched. My arms burned, but I didn't stop. Something primal drove me forward, the sense that if I relented, if I gave the smallest space, something else would claim him fully. At last, his heart rhythm flickered back, a weak sinus rhythm crawling across the monitor. We all exhaled, the collective relief filling the bay like a wave. But as his chest rose again under the ventilator's push, I felt the pressure in the room intensify, as if the very air had thickened. Then it happened. The ventilator cycled normally. Inhale, exhale, but in the space between, I heard it. A low exhalation, longer than the machine, longer than his body could have produced. It came from just above his head, brushing the hair at my temples, moving across my skin like a cold draft, though the ER was stifling hot. I froze mid-motion, the catheter trembling in my hand. The nurse beside me didn't react, neither did the physician. The only other person who seemed to notice was his daughter, who lifted her head suddenly, her face pale. "It's here," she whispered, and the conviction in her voice made my blood run cold. I wanted to deny it, to laugh it off as exhaustion, but I couldn't. Because I had felt it. Something moving, something breathing, that was not supposed to be. And when I looked down at him, I could swear his eyelids fluttered, his lips moving around the tube as though trying to form words. I bent close, unable to stop myself, and heard the faintest rasp. Not again. This time, it was unmistakable. The rest of the shift carried on with clinical precision. Labs ordered, adjustments made, another consult called. But inside me, something had shifted irrevocably. Every sound in the ER felt different. The hiss of oxygen no longer comforted me. It carried menace. The beep of monitors sounded less like reassurance, more like a countdown. Even my own breathing felt foreign, as if each inhalation risked taking in something I could never exhale. During a brief lull, I found myself outside again, leaning against the cool plaster of the hallway wall. I pressed my palm to my chest, feeling the steady beat beneath, yet every breath I took felt heavier, as though I wasn't alone in it anymore. I thought of Daniel as a boy, the way his lungs would seize, the way he'd look at me with terror, eyes wide and lips blue. But unlike Daniel, this man didn't seem terrified. He seemed resigned, as if he knew exactly what was happening and had seen it before. The daughter found me there, stepping softly into the corridor. She didn't speak at first, just stood beside me, staring at the opposite wall as though she could see through it. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "You heard it too, didn't you?" I couldn't bring myself to answer. Not yes, not no. Silence was safer. But she looked at me, and in my silence she found her confirmation. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they didn't fall. She seemed almost relieved, as if the burden of witnessing it alone had been too heavy. We returned to the bay together. The patient lay as he had before, tethered to machines, suspended between two worlds. But the room felt occupied. Every corner seemed to breathe. And as the afternoon sun scorched the desert outside, inside Bay 5, I began to wonder whether breath itself could be haunted. By the time the afternoon bled into evening, the ER had transformed into its usual storm. Stretchers lined against the walls, triage overflowing, the sharp metallic scent of blood mingling with antiseptic in the air. But for me, the entire department narrowed to Bay 5. Other patients came and went, other crises demanded attention, but every spare moment pulled me back to the man tethered to the ventilator, to the daughter who hadn't moved from his side, and to the air in that room that felt more crowded than its four walls should allow. His numbers had stabilized in the technical sense. Oxygenation hovered tenuously in the 90s, with the machine working at maximum settings, his blood pressure bolstered by medications dripping steadily into his veins. On paper, we were winning. But no one in that room felt victory. His skin had grown colder, his features sharper, as though life was draining through a crack we couldn't seal. And each time the ventilator cycled, forcing his chest to rise, I couldn't help but hear something else breathing with us, filling the silence between machine-driven sighs. The daughter had stopped whispering to him in fragments. Now she spoke softly, but continuously, as though reciting a litany only he could understand. "You don't have to open the door. You can keep it shut. It has no power if you don't let it. Not this time. Not this time." Her words should have sounded delusional, But instead, they threaded seamlessly into the atmosphere, as though they belonged there, a second layer of the ER's soundscape. At one point, while I was adjusting the ventilator, she turned to me suddenly. "He told me you'd be here." The words made my hand still on the tubing. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice lower than intended. Her gaze was unwavering. "He said a woman with dark hair and tired eyes would help him fight for his last breath. That he'd know her when she leaned close." She paused, her lips trembling. "That was you, wasn't it? You heard him. You heard what he said." I wanted to deny it, to retreat into the safety of clinical language, but the truth hung heavy between us. I had heard him, more than once, and each time the words hadn't been directed at the air, but at me. The rest of the staff seemed oblivious, or maybe they had simply compartmentalized the way medicine trains you to. The attending physician charted mechanically. Nurses moved in and out, with syringes and saline. No one flinched when the ventilator's rhythm faltered for a second. No one blinked when the monitor gave a warning tone that resolved without intervention. But I noticed. Each stutter of the machine felt intentional, as if something unseen tested the boundaries of our control. Around 8 p.m., the room shifted. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder, flickering faintly as if the current itself wavered. The air grew heavier, humid in a way desert nights never are. I stood at the head of the bed, suctioning secretions, when the daughter stiffened suddenly. "It's here again," she whispered, and I felt it before I could argue. A draft brushed across my arms, cold and wrong, cutting through the heat of the ER. The ventilator cycled, hissed, forced another breath, and then, layered against its rhythm, came the sound. A long, low exhalation, deeper than any machine, older than any human lungs. It filled the space above us, pressing down like an invisible hand. I froze, my gloved hand still clutching the catheter. And for a moment, I couldn't breathe at all. My chest locked, my throat refused air. I felt as if something had slipped inside my lungs, occupying the space where breath should be. The daughter gripped the rail of the bed, her knuckles white. "Not this time," she whispered fiercely to her father. "Don't open it. Don't let it in." The monitor shrieked then, heart rate plummeting, oxygen dropping like a stone. The doctor barked orders, the team swarming in. But everything felt muffled, distant, as if I were underwater. I moved through the motions, disconnecting the circuit, bagging him manually, pressing the valve to force oxygen into his chest. But each push of air seemed swallowed, stolen, before it reached his lungs. His chest barely rose. We began compressions again, the rhythmic pounding of his sternum reverberating through the room. Medications were pushed, shocks delivered. His body jerked, his skin ashen, his lips parted around the tube. And once again, I bent close, straining to hear. This time, the words were clearer than ever, rasped through a dying throat. "Not again. Don't let it." The final word slipped away, unfinished, but I knew what it was. In that moment, something shifted in me. I had spent years in emergency medicine believing in systems, in physiology, in the measurable patterns of life and death. But here, under the glare of hospital lights, I felt certain that something outside of science had joined us, something that did not belong but refused to leave. The team fought hard, but each cycle of CPR left him weaker, less responsive. His rhythm returned twice, only to collapse again. It was as if he were being pulled from both sides, our hands dragging him back, something unseen tugging him further away. And with each tug, the air thickened until I struggled to draw my own breath. At one point, the daughter broke from the wall and pressed her palm against my arm. Her touch startled me, grounding me for a second. Her voice trembled but carried conviction. "It's not you it wants. Don't let it in through you." The words hit harder than the alarms. Because in the back of my mind, in the hollow space of each breath I took, I had begun to fear exactly that. We worked for nearly 40 minutes. In medicine, that's an eternity. By the end, his skin was waxy, his body limp. The monitor flatlined again, the shrill tone slicing the room. The doctor's voice was weary, resigned. "Call it." But before the words could finalize, before the time could be marked forever in his chart, something happened that none of us could explain. The ventilator, though disconnected from active cycling, let out a sound, a long, slow inhale, as if the machine itself had drawn breath. The bellows expanded without a trigger, the tubing quivered. And then, just as slowly, it exhaled, a drawn-out sigh that filled the room. Everyone froze. For once, it wasn't just me and the daughter who heard it. Nurses glanced at each other. The physician's mouth went tight. No one spoke. The daughter began to cry then, but not with despair, with something closer to relief. "He closed the door," she whispered, her tears soaking into the sheets. The monitor stayed flat. His chest stayed still. The fight was over. But the air had not cleared. It hung heavy, charged, as though something lingered in suspension. I pulled the tube from his airway, condensation dripping down the plastic. As I disposed of it, I swore I felt warmth against my cheek, like the ghost of breath passing me. The doctor left quietly. The nurses drifted to other bays. The daughter stayed, her hand still clasped around his. I lingered at the doorway, unable to step fully out, unable to convince myself the shift was truly done. My chest felt heavy, each breath deliberate. And I realized, with a chill colder than any draft, that whatever had haunted his lungs had brushed mine too. After they wheeled his body to the morgue, Bay 5 felt hollow, but far from empty. The fluorescent lights glared down, the sheets stripped, the ventilator wheeled away, yet the space still held weight. I stood in the doorway longer than I should have, mask pulled down around my neck, gloves dangling loose in my hand. The ER bustled beyond, trauma calls, a psych patient screaming down the hall, the hiss of suction from another bay. But here, silence reigned. Silence thick, with breath that wasn't ours. I told myself to move on, to do what we always do in medicine. Shift the focus, reset the mind, carry on. But every time I inhaled, I felt resistance, as though the air didn't belong fully to me anymore. His daughter remained by the bedside until security gently urged her away. She kissed his forehead once, whispered something too soft to catch, then looked at me with eyes that held both gratitude and a terrible knowing. "Thank you," she said, her voice frayed. "You kept him long enough for him to shut it out." Her words sent a tremor through me, because they sounded less like grief and more like completion. When she left, clutching the worn purse to her chest, I felt abandoned in a way I hadn't anticipated. Whatever truth she carried left with her, and I was stranded with nothing but questions and the faint echo of that impossible sigh. The rest of my shift staggered forward. I responded to other patients, an elderly woman with CHF exacerbation, a young man in withdrawal thrashing against restraints, a child who'd swallowed a coin, but I moved through them like a ghost. My body acted, my voice spoke, my hands adjusted tubing and turned dials, but my mind was still back in Bay 5, caught on a dying man's whisper, and the feel of borrowed breath against my cheek. By the time I left St. Catherine's the next morning, the desert sun was already punishing. I stepped into the parking lot, heat radiating from the asphalt in shimmering waves. Normally, the dry air of Tucson felt clean, expansive, a contrast to the suffocating nights of El Paso with my brothers wheezing in the next room. But that morning, each breath tasted heavy, metallic, as though I carried remnants of the ER inside me. Driving home, I thought of Daniel. I remembered his small frame folded in my grandmother's arms, his lungs struggling, the way his eyes begged silently for air. I had promised myself as a girl that I would be the one to save people like him, that I would never let anyone gasp alone. Yet here I was, shaken by the memory of a man whose every gasp had carried warnings I couldn't comprehend. Warnings that had outlived him. Sleep didn't come easily in the days that followed. When it did, it came with dreams. I'd wake with the sensation of someone exhaling against my face, warm and intimate, though my room was empty. Once, I dreamed of Bay 5 itself, stripped, sterile, but filled wall to wall with mist, as though the air had taken form. In the dream, I leaned down and heard his voice again. Not again. I woke, gasping, my chest tight, convinced I had inhaled something foreign in the night. I tried to bury myself in work. The ER doesn't give you much space to linger anyway. New traumas replaced old, fresh emergencies demanded every ounce of focus. But no matter how many patients I bagged, how many ventilators I set, how many lives I tried to steady with air, I couldn't escape the thought that breath itself was no longer neutral. One evening, weeks later, I walked past Bay 5. It was occupied by another patient, a man in his 40s, recovering from a car wreck, snoring lightly under sedation. The ventilator cycled steadily beside him, its hiss familiar, its rhythm steady. I told myself it was normal. Routine. Nothing more than air, moved by machinery. But as I turned to leave, the ventilator paused, just for a second in the way they sometimes do. And in that pause, I swore I heard it again. That long, low exhalation, filling the silence. I gripped the doorway, heart pounding, waiting for someone else to react. No one did. The nurses charted, the monitors beeped, the patient slept on. But I knew. Medicine teaches you to demand proof. Labs, scans, numbers. But what proof do you have when the evidence is the very air around you? What chart can capture the weight of a whisper that should not exist? What statistic can quantify the moment when a patient's last breath feels like it has entered your own lungs and refused to leave? I started noticing small things after that. Condensation forming on tubing when it shouldn't. The faint smell of ozone lingering in rooms where patients had coded. Drafts that moved across my arms though no door had opened. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe I was unraveling under the strain. Or maybe St. Catherine's had become a place where more than bodies came to die. One night, sitting alone in the break room, I found myself pressing my palm against my chest again, feeling the steady beat beneath. I inhaled slowly, deeply, trying to convince myself it was just breath, nothing more. But even then, I couldn't shake the sense that my lungs no longer belonged solely to me. Sometimes, when I'm working with a patient, I wonder what breath I'm giving them. When I bag them manually, pressing the valve to force air into their chest, I wonder, is it mine, or is it something else moving through me? And when I lean close to reassure them, to promise safety, I hear the echo of his warning, don't let it in. I think of his daughter often. I wonder where she is now, what she carries, whether she still feels watched when she breathes. I wonder if she meant it when she said he had closed the door. Because if he did, why do I feel it pressing, still, waiting, in the corners of every quiet room? In the ER, breath is everything. It is the first thing you check, the last thing you fight for. The measure of whether life continues. We call it spontaneous when it returns on its own. Mechanical when we steal it back with machines. But that night in Bay 5 taught me that breath might not belong entirely to us. That it might carry more than oxygen. That it might remember. I was a respiratory therapist in the ER, and I thought I understood air. I thought it was science, ratios, liters per minute, pressures and flows. But now I know different. Breath is not just survival. Breath is presence. Breath is memory. And sometimes, breath does not leave when the body does. The case will always remind me of that truth. The case will always haunt me, because his last breath I can never be certain it left.